this year I did a spring wrap up where I talked about all the books I read from March until May. I said I would do a summer wrap up before I went back to school, but clearly we have failed. But I still want to talk about all the books that I read over the summer between the end of May and the end of August. I read a total of 42 books. Since there's so many of them, I'm going to try and talk about them very quickly. But if you want to see my extended thoughts, I recommend checking out my weekly reading vlogs where I talk about them extensively, and my Goodreads review, which I write right after I finish the book when it's fresh in my mind. The first book I read was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste. This book is a thriller literary fiction hybrid about a Chinese American family whose oldest daughter disappears, and the book's narrative follows each of the family members' perspectives and what all led to this disappearance and her eventual discovery. I think it was a good exploration of family, and the writing style was gorgeous. I listened to this on audiobook and it went by very quickly. It wasn't the most remarkable thing I've ever read, but it did make me feel a lot for the family and sympathize for what they were going through, so I give it 4 stars. The next book I read was an audiobook for 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khalid. This is a book about 2 women in Pakistan who end up married to the same man, and it follows those 2 women's lives as they grow up. I just adore Khalid Hosseini's writing style. He makes everything so well fleshed out, and even though I've never been to Pakistan and I've never had to experience what these women go through, it's just so real and richly written. They are incredible audiobooks. If you want to pick up audiobooks, I highly recommend Khalid Hosseini's books, and this one was a definite standout. I gave it 5 stars. It was magnificent. The next book I read was Roomies by Christina. This book follows a girl who lives in New York City, and her uncle is a very well-known Broadway composer, producer. One day they need a guitarist for their orchestra, so the main character of this book decides to employ this guy that she kind of knows from the subway that plays his guitar there, only to find out that he's in the country illegally, so to be able to work for them, they have to get married. So it's like a fake marriage trope. This one just really dragged, even though it's about Broadway, which is something I'm interested in. The character was just very sidelined, and the relationship between the 2 characters wasn't that angsty at all. The stakes just felt very low for a relationship that's literally illegal. So I think they could have done more to spice up the story. I just gave it a very meh 3 stars. The next book I read was An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth by Chris Hadfield, and it's all about how he is a Canadian astronaut who has been to the International Space Station. Although this is a lot about his experience in space and explaining how he got there and what he does there, it's also a lot of advice that pertains to people on Earth like me who are terrified of space and would never do that, probably couldn't even begin to try and be a scientist. But it gives a lot of great advice about how to be a leader and how to manage anxiety and fear. It was really easy to understand, even though it is about a very scientific topic. I thought it was a fun listen, and I gave that book 4 stars. The next book I read was Trade Me by Courtney Millan, which is a new adult book about a girl in college. She's very poor and has hardly any money to send home. One day in class, she overhears a comment from a very rich student talking about class and money, and she says, "You wouldn't last a day in my shoes," and he says, "Bet." They take on this challenge to switch roles, but it really just felt like this book catered toward the guy and how he was like, "Oh, it's so hard to live in a house with no working electricity," which was pretty disappointing. I also felt like the main character and the guy had no real chemistry in their relationship. I was skim reading a lot of it just because I was so tired of hearing about the guy's first world problems. It was a little too melodramatic, so I gave it 2 stars. Then I read Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too by Javan Sun, which is a book that I will praise to the high heavens because it is one of my favorites of all year. This is a graphic novel about an alien named Jomny who goes to Earth to study humanity, and he meets a bunch of animals and critters along the way. It is the most wholesome book I have read in my entire life. Every single page has a motivational message. Every single page reminds you that it's okay to not be okay and you'll do okay eventually, and it's just so uplifting and sweet, and it's that type of humor that I just get. I gave this book a full 5 stars. It made me laugh, it made me cry. It's so cute. Transitioning abruptly to I Hate My Selfie by Shane Dawson, which is his first nonfiction book of essays, but I really did not like it. I like the 2018 Shane Dawson. I think he's super funny. I like his attitude, but the humor that he uses in this book and the humor that he used like pre-2016, I'm not into it. I just don't think bestiality jokes are funny, rape jokes are funny, fat jokes are funny. I guess guess that makes me a social activist. I gave it 2 stars and I got rid of his second book because I'm just not interested in that type of humor. The next book was an audiobook I listened to on Memoir. It was Being Jazz by Jennings. This is written by a young transgender woman who is very well known for transitioning at an early age. This book just follows the troubles that she's had growing up, trying to get on different hormones, trying to play sports, and she's a very big advocate for letting kids transition to become their authentic selves. This book made me very emotional many times because it was just so touching to hear about a girl who has such a supportive family behind her. Because she's so young, I think it was a fun audiobook to listen to in her voice. I gave it 4 stars. The next book I read was the first book in the Judy Moody series by McDaniel, which I thought I read as a kid. It's this book about this girl who is sassy and she's always in a bad mood, and I didn't remember anything. So either I read it so long ago that I didn't recall anything, or it's just something that I remember from my childhood but I never actually read. I gave this book 3 stars just because it wasn't my cup of tea. She was just rude to her brother all the time. She was very impulsive and sassy to her friends. I just didn't think she was a good example. But it was still fun to revisit and read it in a very quick amount of time. The next book I read was another memoir on audiobook, which was Talking as Fast as I Can by Lauren Graham. I tried finishing Gilmore Girls this summer, but it just couldn't happen. I gave up on the last season. But I still enjoyed listening to this book because I love Lauren. I think she's a great actress. This book was funny. It was entertaining. However, I think the content strayed more toward useless information rather than stories about her life or things that I would have appreciated her talking about. So it felt a little bit aimless. I gave it 3 stars, but I think it was still fun to listen to. The next book I read was a new adult book called The Year We Fell Down by Serena Bowen, which is about a girl in college who's in a wheelchair. She lives in an accessible dorm room, and across the hall from her is another accessible dorm room where there is a man who has broken his leg, and so he's having a hard time getting around, and they just get to know each other because they are the 2 disabled people in the dorm at the time. I really didn't like this book at all. I think this book used this character's disability as a gimmick and a selling point. It just seemed like the author was treating it very lightly, and like the character's disability was a burden to her all the time, and the way she would talk about it was very gross. I have extended thoughts in my reviews you can find in my vlog or my Goodreads review. I just don't think it was handled well. I don't think the action in the book was that interesting. I didn't like the inner monologue of the characters, but the romance scenes were nice. So that was its saving grace. I gave it 2 stars. I listened to another memoir on audiobook, if you couldn't tell. I was on my audiobook game this summer because I had a 40-minute commute to work. I listened to How to Be a Boss by Lilly Singh, who is a YouTuber who I actually don't watch. I just was interested in reading this book because I like her personality. It was just entertaining. I like Lily's voice and her enthusiasm and her passion, so I gave that 3 stars. Then I took on the massive feat of reading The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. It is a novel about this young man named Theo who, when he was younger, was in a explosion at an art gallery that killed his mom, but he somehow miraculously survived. And it follows his life after that tragedy, and he's harboring this stolen painting from that museum the day that that explosion occurred, and it just is about secrets and family, making bad friends and questionable choices. This just took me so long to finish, and my lasting impression of it is that it was gorgeous, and I loved the way the story unfolded, and I loved our main character. It just was so much. I think 200 pages of this book could easily have been edited out of it just because it was so slow moving. So I gave it 3.5 stars. Next I read Bright We Burn by Kirsten White, which is the final book in the Conquerors saga. This series is a Vlad the Impaler retelling with a female Vlad. It's all about war politics between the Ottoman Empire and Wallachians. I can't really go into what this book's about because so much happens, but I think this series is incredible. I love the characters. It's a very refreshing story because I'm not a fan of historical fiction or politically based drama, but the way that this book series does it makes it incredibly addicting. The characters are so smart and the decisions they make are so well-founded. So the way the author handles character interactions and character relationships is so intricate. I think it's a very great series. I gave her 5 stars. I couldn't not. I think it was a fantastic conclusion to the series. Next. I reread Restore Me, the only book I can hold up so far because all the other books are at my house. This is the 4th book in the Shatter Me series by Tartt and Mafi, which is about a girl who touches people and they die. This book just takes the series to new stakes. It's like a bridge book between this trilogy and the next book to come, in my opinion. I just wanted to read it again so I could add more sticky tabs. Obviously gave this book 5 stars. Defy Me theories are coming soon. The next book I finished was 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult. This is a story about a school shooting, and it goes into the court trial and the lawyers and the students around him and the shooter himself, just fleshing out what happened and what the consequences are for this person. I gave this book 4 stars. I think it was an interesting book with great writing that really let you into the life of someone who's very troubled, but it was hindered by a couple of things, like how outdated it was, and it sort of read like a Lifetime movie just because it was generic. Nevertheless, I listened to it on audio and I think that it was a really good story that put me in the shoes of the characters, so I would recommend that book on audio. Next, I read The Proposal by Jasmine Guillory as an e-arc from NetGalley. This is a romance book that's set to come out in the fall about a woman who gets publicly proposed to at a baseball game and she has to let him down. It's very embarrassing. It goes viral. The person who saves her ends up becoming good friends with her. There's a black main character, Korean side character, Latino love interest. It was amazing, but I really didn't like this book. I tried to, it just wasn't happening. There wasn't that great of chemistry between the characters. I wasn't ever like dying for them to get together. The main downfall of this book for me though was the writing style. The descriptions were generic. It used very uninventive language. It got to the point where whenever the characters would talk to each other, their actions were very cyclical. Like one would laugh, one would smile, one would shrug, one would roll their eyes, and it just felt very juvenile. The next book I read was Making Faces by Amy Harmon, which is another romance book, but I'm not sure if it'd be new adult. You got YA or adult. This is a story about a young girl who falls for this boy named Ambrose when they're in high school. After high school, he gets shipped off to war and then comes back with this horrid facial disfigurement because of an explosion that happens. And it's all about those two people finding each other once again and having to learn to love one another, not based on physical beauty. I think this book's message was great and the writing style is genuinely in the top percentile of books that I've read, especially romances. The writing was gorgeous. I just think that the pacing of this book was weird because it spends so much time developing their childhoods together and their high school events that by the time we got to the actual end of it with the romance and stuff, it just felt very rushed. I didn't like how this built and built and built and then nothing happens in the end. But the writing style made it worth it and I do think it had a good message, so I gave it 4 stars. Next, I listened to another YouTuber's audiobook, Grace's Guide by Grace Helbig, and I actually think that her advice book brings some value past others' advice books because she just does not care about getting nitty-gritty. She does not censor herself, and she doesn't give a glamorized view of life. I like that she has that approach to giving people advice that's just like, sometimes it sucks and you have to work through it, but do this and try and do your best and maybe you'll get there. I think this book is really entertaining to listen to, but once again, no lasting impressions, so I gave it 3 stars. Then I read one of my favorite books of the year, which is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. This book follows a girl named Hazel who is very eccentric and she has deemed herself not dateable because she's so weird. She doesn't think guys will ever be into her, and then she ends up being reunited with an old college friend named Josh, and they end up being together more often, getting to know one another, and things ensue. It's one of my new favorites. If you like Jess from New Girl, you have to pick this book up. It's literally New Girl. It's so much fun. It's so relatable. It's a realistic writing style, a realistic relationship. I don't think Christina Lauren tries to glamorize any aspects of relationships. The way it's written is so much fun and it just goes by so fast. I have very few complaints about this book other than there's a random plot twist at the end that I'm not a fan of. Some people might be a fan of it, so it's like a personal preference thing, but it just ended on a note that I was left like, why? I gave that book 4.5 stars though, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I listened to another memoir, Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. It was good, but not one of the best books of all time, like people make it seem. It's about this woman who's dealing with a divorce, and so she decides to go on this escapade to 3 different countries and just find herself. And more than anything, it was a spiritual journey for her when I wished it would have focused more on the physical journey that she had and the things she experienced, the foods she ate and all that fun stuff. So So I really couldn't relate to how much she was talking about God in this, but I do think it was written very well, so I gave it 4 stars. Listened to another book of essays. This one was called Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris, which is about David Sedaris' time in France when he was learning French. He's known for his humorous writing style, and I think that that was one of the best parts of this book. It was never edgy or corny. It was just so well developed and well done. Really enjoyed listening to this. I think he's funny and I would definitely read more from him, so I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I listened to another memoir. Are you shocked? I read In the Body of the World by Eve Ensler, which is her story about when she got uterine cancer that spread to her colon and her nether regions. But it was a raw explanation of what it's like to be a woman being treated in the healthcare system, what recovery is like, just how brutal humanity can be to the treatment of other people in the environment. I loved this book. It's definitely one of my favorite feminist books of the year, and I would highly recommend it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I read The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang, which is a romance book about an autistic woman who is not good at love or relationships, so she hires a male escort to help her learn how to do those things more effectively. I think this book is really cute. I love the slow progression of their relationship, and I like how supportive the guy was for the girl. The only thing that bothered me about this book was that usually I can fly through romance books, but this one took me so long to read. The writing style of it is just a little bit bland, and there's not that much action going on as well, but I gave that book 3.5 stars. Then I listened to Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, which is a book about this man who hiked Everest during an expedition where 16 people unfortunately died on the descent due to bad weather. I really enjoyed listening to this. I think it was a well fleshed out story about what happened and what it's like to climb mountains, and as someone who has never done that before, I never thought it was boring or hard to understand. However, the way that he tries to build this story about so many people sometimes felt scattered because there were so many people and you had to keep timelines straight and who's who and who's where. I wish it would have focused more linearly on one person, maybe individual accounts of what happened to each person. I don't know what I want. It was just hard to understand toward the end. Maybe it was my fault for listening to it on audio and getting it confused that format. Still, it was interesting, so I gave it 4 stars. Then I read an arc of The Reckoning of Noah Shaw by Michelle Hodkin, which was not good. Nothing happens. It is 300 pages of actual garbage. The book takes place in like 12 hours and it's just them like stumbling around the London and the dark. Just skip this book. This is the first book I gave 1 star all year, but it was so bad. I read The January Children by Safia El Hio, which is about Sudan and post-colonialism, feeling split between 2 cultures, America and Africa. This is a poetry collection that I actually remember enjoying, and I remember some of the poems and the themes, so I think that alone makes it worthy of praise. I gave this book 4 stars because it was so well written and made me think. I underlined a lot of different lines from it. Then I read Sweet Filthy Boy by Christina Lauren, which is another adult romance book. This book follows a girl who is having a night out in Vegas after she graduates college and ends up having a fling with a guy that she sees there, and they wake up the next morning and he invites her to go live with him for the summer in his apartment in Paris, and so she accepts the offer and has to get vulnerable with this guy that she barely knows. This book was very good. Probably not everyone's cup of tea, but I think that it was a good exploration of opening yourself up to new opportunities. I really like Christina Lauren main characters because they're so unafraid to speak their minds and confident, whereas a lot of adult romance authors make women like these oh woe is me creatures who need saving. The main guy in this book was also very sweet and passionate and hot, so not a bad thing to have at all. Again, there's just like small plot elements that Christina Lauren puts in her books that I'm not a fan of, but it's complete personal preference, so I gave this book 4.5 stars. Then I read Tale of a Dragon Princess by Lizzie Colt. This is a femme/fantasy book that I got from NetGalley about this princess who was cursed when she was a child, that after her 16th birthday she would turn into a dragon every night, and it's all about how she wants a neighboring female warrior to take her to that sorceress to undo that spell, so it's their journey together to go do that. I thought it was very cute, but it was too short and needs a lot of editing. This book is not the best it could be in its current state, and I hope that when it gets published there will be better wording. The plot could definitely use some fleshing out to make things less generic, but it was a very cute story, and I think it deserves credit for doing something that hardly any authors do, which is non-contemporary femme-slash. Speaking of non-contemporary femme-slash, I read The Dark Wife by S.E. Deemer, which is another femme-slash romance between Hades and Persephone in a gender-bent edition where there are two women. So this book follows Persephone as she goes to the underworld to live with Hades. I loved the writing of this book because it was so well fleshed out and I could just see all the little details of the underworld. But I wish that the relationship in this book had an overhaul of the pace it was done at, because it seems like the characters just conveniently end up together after almost nothing happens between them. So I wish that there was more conflict in this book rather than just sitting around, but I gave it 4.5 stars. I highly recommend it. Then I read Ghost Boy by Martin Pistorius, which is about a young man who went into a coma when he was young and survived, but doctors assumed for him to be brain dead and he had no function. He was paralyzed, he was mute, so they ended up just putting him in facilities for care and didn't really give him an opportunity to express himself because they didn't realize that he was actually fully aware of his surroundings. He could understand people and he could still think and have thoughts, but he just couldn't express them because he was nonverbal. So this is about his journey being able to get a voice again. And it was a long and grueling journey for him that was really heartbreaking to hear about, but at the same time very empowering to see someone go from thinking they're never gonna have a good life because no one recognizes that, hey, they're still a person and they can still have opinions, to being able to be independent and get married and start a business. It was just an incredible transformation. So I loved that. I gave it 4 stars. The final book I'm gonna talk about is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book is a literary fiction book about a group of Greek students at a university who are very close-knit. They are very estranged from the rest of the campus, and they are this mystical group of people. The main character of this book is new to campus and is very enchanted by them and wants to be in with them, and once he just gets swept up in a whirlwind of their life and they end up murdering one of their classmates. Just like in the Goldfinch, the writing style of this was very pretty and every single line made me stop and be like, wow, I'm never gonna be a successful author when there's people like this who exist. The characterization of this book is so gorgeous, and it's just the type of story I love that's melancholy and image heavy with morally gray characters who are interesting but somehow still realistic. I really have no complaints about it other than it just is a commitment, but it's a totally worth it commitment. It's a very heavy but memorable book and I highly recommend it. Finally, you can hear me stop talking. I had a very eventful summer, as you can tell. I didn't realize half of what I read was just audiobooks in the car. Nevertheless, I tried some new genres, I discovered some new favorite books, and hopefully via my recommendation you'll find some new favorites too. Thank you for sticking around. I hope you had a good time. Let me know what your favorite books of the summer were, or if anything I talked about you have read before and loved. I will see you all next time. Goodbye.